Do you want to know what I think is one of the best, if not the best tool for analyzing DNA? It's called WATO, and you're going to learn about it today. Howdy, I'm Andy Lee with Family History Fanatics, and this is a segment of DNA. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and click on that bell if you want to be notified about upcoming episodes. Now today I'm going to tell you about the WATO tool, or what are the odds. And the reason why this tool is so great is because it allows you to analyze an unknown person with the known DNA that you share with them as well as with other people. So let's jump over to DNA Painter and I'll show you how the WATO tool works. Now the WATO tool was developed by Leah Larkin, and it is on Johnny Pearl's website of DNA Painter, and this is free to use. So sign up for an account on DNA Painter and then you can use the WATO tool all that you want and be able to save some of that information. Now on the tools section we go down and here is the what are the odds tool, and it comes up with our canvas of what we're going to be looking at. Let me go down and share some information at the bottom here. First off, if you want to learn more about this tool, then go on over here to Leah Larkin's blog. And in her series, Science the Heck Out of Your DNA, she explains all of the statistics behind what the WATO tool is. But for those of you who aren't interested in knowing that much statistics, it's okay. You can actually use the WATO tool without understanding all that. You just need to understand a few basic principles. Now, as you're doing this, there's a few things to remember, and Leah mentions this in the caveats down here. First off, when we're using the WATO tool, it is not designed to have double relationships. So if you have double cousins in some way, then the WATO tool is not necessarily going to give you the results that you want. They may be inaccurate. The other thing is three-quarter relationships. For instance, if you have a mother who had two children from different fathers, but those fathers were brothers, that would be three-quarter siblings. And that is another relationship that is not really handled by the WATO tool. And finally, matches that are known to have a lot of endogamy. And the reason why this is a problem is that it increases the overall DNA, even though that relationship may be far distant. And so you're going to get inaccurate results if you have a lot of endogamy for that match. But knowing that, let's go on up and let's start using the WATO tool. Now I'm going to use an example today that is a real example that I used in some of my research on my family. I've changed the names so that all the living people are not identified. But the first thing we want to do is we want to create a tree of known matches and how they relate to each other. So you need to start out with at least two matches that you know how they relate to each other, and then we can build the hypothesis from there. So in this case, I actually have a group of 4 matches that I know how they relate to each other. So I can start with one person, and what I can do is I can just type this person's name in, and I'm going to type in the first person's name. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to put the amount of DNA that they share with my target person in parentheses. And from there now, I can start adding parents and children. In this case, I'm just going to add a parent. And now the parent shows up, and I can change that name, and I can then add their parent, and then I can change that name, and I can add their parent. And at some point, you're going to get back to a common ancestor. Now, that may be a common couple, or it may be a single person in the case of where you have half siblings that you have your matches descended from. So in this case, I'm actually going to put in the common couple that I know all these matches are related to. So this is James and Christina. So there's my first line. So this is my first match that I have with my target unknown person. And now I can start to build my second match with this target unknown person. Now, the other matches are all related through a sibling of this Benjamin. So what I can do is I can go to the parents and I can add another child. And this child is Christina. And then Christina had 3 children. So I'm going to add 3 children. And each one of these children all have one match as one of their descendants. So I'm going to edit these. I got Herbert, I got Jesse, and I have Frank. Now each one of these have a child, and each one of these also have a child, which ends up being the match. So I'm going to just leave that child name as child. I'm going to add their children and put in the match information. So for instance, right here, I have Jane. And right here, I have John. And then right here, I have George. All right. Now, the reason why I'm putting the amount of centimorgans in parentheses is just so that I can be changing some of these amounts to show you how different things work. But this is the basic tree that you're first doing, is you have your matches, that you have how much they match with the target person, and you have how those matches are related to each other. So I'm going to name this based off of my target person. And in this case, my target person's name is Elizabeth. So this is a tree for Elizabeth. So now next is what I want to do is I want to put in the amount of shared DNA that each one of these people has with Elizabeth. And so when I go to the menu, there's enter the shared CM, and I can enter that number in. So in this case, it's 155.7. Now you can enter in the amount of centimorgans, or if you have the percentages, for instance, from 23andMe or from MyHeritage, you can also enter the percentage there. And Jane has 33.8, and John has 32.9, and George has 36.2. So I've put in all of the amount of shared DNA that they have with this Elizabeth, this unknown person. And you'll notice Elizabeth is not on this map yet. So now it's time to actually put Elizabeth on this map. Now, how are you going to know where to put Elizabeth? Well, usually what I like to do is I like to go and I find the highest amount of shared DNA. So in this case, this would be Jack. And then I put that number into the shared CM project tool. And that will give you the list of different relationships. And then I'll go through and just start putting these in. So let me just start adding some different relationships. Now, the first one, since this is actually pretty close over here, is I'm going to add a child to Carl. And I'm going to maybe make that a grandson. And so here, I want to use this as my first hypothesis. And you can see that this hypothesis has a score of 0 right now, which means it's not really possible. That's too close of a relationship for it to be that person. Well, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over to this child. Now, this is the brother of Jack, and I'm going to define a half relationship. I'm going to say this is actually a half sibling of Jack. Now, when I say it's a half sibling of Jack, all of a sudden that hypothesis becomes possible. Now, it's not good enough to just have one hypothesis, because the one hypothesis means that it's either possible or it's not possible. What you want to have is you want to have many different hypotheses, so then you can actually compare which hypothesis is the most likely. So let me go and start putting in some other hypotheses. So for instance, we did a child of Carl, so let's do another child of Benjamin. And we're going to add children to that. And then we're going to start putting hypotheses in. Now we can put as many hypotheses as we want. So let me just add these two right here as hypotheses. So this would be Jack's grandfather, another son or daughter from that grandfather, their grandson or great-grandson. And you can see all of a sudden these numbers are starting to change a little bit. Hypothesis 1 has a score of 7. Hypothesis 3 has a score of 68,570. And hypothesis 2 has a score of 1. So what does this mean? Well, let's go down and we can get to the explanation of the hypotheses. And you can see this is calculated that, hey, hypothesis 3 This means that this location of that match is about 9,796 times more likely than the next hypothesis. So if this was the only possibilities, then what you can do is you can really focus on looking at hypothesis 3. In other words, the great grandchild of Benjamin through one of his siblings, or through one of Carl's siblings. Now, the thing to always remember with the WATO tool, and one thing that the shared CM project isn't always going to show, particularly when you get out to more distant relationships, is half relationships. There's always the possibility that somebody's descended through a half relationship. So what I can do is I can add another child to Benjamin, and now I'm going to define a half relationship, and I'm going to say that this person is a half sibling of both Carl and this other child. Now, if you don't have DNA, you don't have to put all of the children. So for instance, Benjamin may have had Carl and John and Fred and George, but since I only had DNA from Carl, he's the only one listed because John and Fred and George, they're all represented by this other child right here. Now this half sibling might not be known to the family, so let's add him, and let's go and add a couple of children, and then let's start making some hypotheses. So let's make this one a hypothesis, and let's make this one a hypothesis. And we can see that we can actually add another child here, and we can make this one a hypothesis. Now the numbers have changed even more. So we have our hypothesis 3 used to be the most likely, but as we go down, we can see that, hey, hypothesis 5 is now the most likely, and it's twice as likely as what hypothesis 3 was. And hypothesis 3 is twice as likely as hypothesis 4. So let's go take a look. So hypothesis 5 is the most likely at this point. So this is actually through a half relationship through Jack's grandfather, and then hypothesis 3, and then we go to hypothesis 6. So we're starting to see where some of these might, but again, we've only gone just a couple of generations, and if we actually go back and we look at this, we can see, well, this person is related through all these others. What if there was another half sibling? So let's add another child, and let's add another half sibling. So we're going to define the relationship as a half sibling to this Benjamin and Christina. And then we're going to add some children. All right, so let's start looking at what possible hypotheses could be. So I'm just going to add some different hypotheses. I'll add another child and use that as a hypothesis. So I've already got up to 9 hypotheses. And so you can see as you keep on adding more and more hypotheses, it gets the separation of which ones are most likely a lot from the ones which are least likely. So for instance, this hypothesis 2, it has a score of 1. It is extremely unlikely because some of these others scores are in the hundreds of thousands. Okay, so let me add something else here. Let's go to one of these children and let's add a line that we're going to look at this as a hypothesis. There's sometimes where a hypothesis is going to be 0. That means it's really not possible based on the odds. Because this person, Elizabeth, who is represented by each one of these hypotheses, she has to match Jack and Jane and John and George all at these amounts of centimorgans in order for that relationship to exist. And so if you come up with any hypotheses that are 0, we can eliminate those right out. And I'm going to just eliminate this entire line right here. So this is now where we can start using this in order for us to research. What we've done is we've narrowed down to the most likely locations on this family tree where this unknown match fits. Now this unknown match may be somebody who is adopted and so they don't know who their biological parents are. It may be that they're just starting in genealogy and maybe they only have 1 or 2 generations of information available. Or it may be that they're just not answering you and you're trying to figure out how they fit into your tree. So Once you've figured out this, then I would actually start on the most likely and try to narrow it down. Now, some of these might be able to be narrowed down. And how can we do that? Well, there's a couple of ways. First off is, I look at it as, is that generation even possible? So let me take a look at hypothesis number 7. Now it has a score of 20,000, which is, 7 times less likely than the most likely, but it's still, somewhat high. But could this person actually be that person? Well, if I know that Jack died a few years ago and he was 95 when he died. So let's say that, he was born 100 years ago in 1919. And I know that Elizabeth, remember, that's who all these hypotheses represent. I know that Elizabeth is 25 years old. Well, then between James and Christina and Jack, and James and Christina and Elizabeth is only 3 generations. And so how likely is it that there is somebody who is 100 and somebody who is 25 in that same generation? It's really unlikely. Now, if you happen to know some more information about these other children, or some more information about Elizabeth's parents as far as when they were born, that might help you to narrow it down or to eliminate some of these hypotheses altogether. And if you can do that, then you can shrink down where this person might be. So let's say based on ages that I have eliminated hypothesis 7. I can go through and I can remove that hypothesis. And so that one's gone, and I just have these ones left. And likewise, maybe I can go through and I can say, hypothesis 6 isn't possible because Elizabeth is, 80 years old. She's almost as old as Jack, but there's not going to be that many generations between Jack's grandfather and Elizabeth in this case. So let me remove that hypothesis as well. And I can actually delete that child. So I've narrowed it down now to just 7 of these hypotheses. And still, hypothesis 5 is the most popular one. And then that's followed by 3. And so that is where I would start my research, is trying to figure out who those children and their descendants are, or if there's any half-siblings. Now you can do that by finding other matches that may match in the same place. You might find some other matches that are closer that you can start adding in. So for instance, let's go through and let me say that I actually found a child of this person who had a descendant who had some DNA. And we're going to call this person Andy, because I like my name, but it's not really me. Now, if I add the amount of shared CM that Andy has with Elizabeth, then these hypothesis numbers are going to change. And let's, in this case, say that I add 155. I actually share as much as Jack. You'll notice now that there's a couple of these hypotheses that are no longer possible, even though before they were very possible. So let me go back and let me change that back to 0. And you'll notice that hypothesis 3 is actually the second most probable hypothesis. So Elizabeth might be in this hypothesis 5, or she might be in this hypothesis 3. But when I add the centimorgans for this other match in, and let's say that it's 155, hypothesis 3 is no longer possible, so I can actually eliminate that one. And in this case now, hypothesis 5 is by far the most likely. It's 10 times more likely than hypothesis 6 down here at the bottom. And we can see that in the table. Every time that you make a change to this table is going to update and help tell you where it is that these are like, oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't hypothesis 6, it was hypothesis 4 at 1479 that is the next most likely. What you enter in for matches matters. And more importantly, if you have a known match that doesn't share DNA, that is important also. If we add in another child, let's add in another child to this Herbert. And let's call this person Caleb. That would be my son, but that's not who this is. Now we have DNA from Caleb, and Caleb, he matches this family. We know he fits into this family, but Caleb doesn't match Elizabeth at all. So I'm going to put in 0 centimorgans for the amount of DNA. Now that may matter depending on how closely related this person is. So for instance, you see, I put 0 centimorgans in here and these numbers didn't change at all. On the other hand, if I change Andy to 0 centimorgans, you can see that the numbers did change. All of a sudden, hypothesis 5 is up to 411,000. And 6 is still high, and 7 now is one of the highest ones as well. But not only that, these are far higher than what the other one is. So if you know that somebody doesn't share DNA with somebody, then that is really important. So as you're building your WATO chart, make sure you're remembering you're comparing your matches to one single person. Now the great thing about this is it doesn't matter if that information is coming from any of the different websites as long as you have a match with that. One thing I would say is if you are using family tree DNA information, make sure that you put in a corrected amount. Now, why do I say that? Let's go and let's take a look at an example here. If I change this Andy match to what I might get from, let's say 23andMe, 35 centimorgans, we can see that hypothesis 5 has a score of 62,544. And the top ones is hypothesis 5, hypothesis 6, and hypothesis 7. Now, the one thing that family tree DNA does that other companies don't do is family tree DNA adds in some of the small segments. And so that can add up to a significant amount. Now, I'm going to just change this up to, let's say, 95, which is completely possible. I have several matches from family tree DNA that really share a low number of centimorgans, but because of all those little tiny segments, it adds up to a lot. Well, once I add that in, these scores change. Now, all of a sudden, hypothesis 5 is 17,659. Now, in this case, the hypothesis 7 is lower than hypothesis 4, but hypothesis 5 and 6 are still in the same spot. Now, that's just because I had one match that had a difference in that. If you have several matches that have that, you may be getting inaccurate results. A lot of the WATO information is from analysis that Ancestry has done, and so reporting all these tiny segments in with the DNA really throws off what those relationships are. But if you're using information where you have a match that you have information from MyHeritage or 23andMe or Ancestry DNA or even Living DNA, or you've gotten it off of GEDmatch, then that information is usually within that 6 or 7 centimorgans and just looking at those segments that are larger than that. And so I just put those information in just as it is. So this was just a quick introduction to the WATO tool. I hope that this is going to be helpful for you. If you haven't used this, then go ahead and try it. Again, this is a free tool and it is excellent for identifying and narrowing down how people might be related to you. If you have any questions about the WATO tool, put it in the comments below and I'll try to answer it. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with all your friends.